Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the old box office. So it's been kind of a weird holiday season this year. We had a really busy November with Thor and Justice League coming out, Coco, Teddy Some 2, a lot of sort of bigger movies coming out. The first couple of weeks of December are super, super quiet. This weekend there's no real major openers, and the same thing with next weekend. And then of course we get to Star Wars The Last Jedi is coming out on the 15th, I believe. So it's a pretty quiet couple of weeks, so I thought I would do a couple of maybe one or two special shows. I'll probably do a year in review before Star Wars, and today I'm going to do a special on Justice League and kind of a post-mortem on Justice League. And if you're not familiar with the post-mortem, it's sort of it comes from the startup world, tech world, where something goes wrong. You sort of meet with everybody involved and walk through, sort of document what happened, analyze what happened, and then come up with some ideas about how to avoid that sort of mistake in the future. But you do have to start out with what exactly happened. So we'll talk a little bit about these different aspects of Justice League and figure out what went wrong, and maybe sort of think about how Warner Brothers and the DCEU moves forward from here. It's going to be an in-depth show, so if you're not interested in Justice League or anything about that, probably don't listen. But I will talk about different aspects of the business as we go out through it. So even if you're not interested in Justice League and you are interested in how the movie business works and the box office in general, I can offer some slight insight into that whole world. But to start out with, let's just talk about what Justice League did, right? Expectations going into its opening weekend were pretty high. When I think they inked the deal for Justice League, the assumption was that it was going to do something similar to Avengers, that is over 180, hopefully over the $200 million opening weekend, and then on for, $500 million domestically alone, and at least 3x that, or about 3x that, I guess, worldwide. Something like that. That was the sort of goal with creating and greenlighting the Justice League idea and the DCEU in general, to be honest with you. Obviously, that didn't happen, right? And so if you're thinking back like 3 years ago, when I believe it started production in 2015, so about 2.5 years ago, when it really was in pre-production, I think the expectation was an Avengers level movie. Now, Batman vs. Superman then opened up right after it started production, and I think changed things a bit. But I think it's important to state that it was expected to do Avengers numbers when this movie was first conceived. And so as we got closer and closer to the release, you had Zack Snyder dropping out. You had the bad reception of Batman vs. Superman. A lot of things were going on, and sort of the expectation continued to drop. It didn't really get into danger territory, I don't think, until I want to say this summer, right? It kind of felt like the marketing wasn't fantastic. But at the same time, Wonder Woman came out and kind of saved the quality issues of DCEU, right? Like, Wonder Woman was great. Everybody that I know who saw it really kind of enjoyed it. I thought it was a pretty good comic book movie, and I'm not a huge comic book guy. It was a big success overall. So I think a lot of people, Warner Brothers, it was a sigh of relief. Like, oh, okay, like we can use this Wonder Woman audience and sort of build into the Justice League big movie here in November. But everything looked like it was gonna be, my gut would say, about 3 months ago over the summer, looking at like a 150-ish opening, maybe 160 on the high end, and maybe it breaks out to his 170. But the Avengers numbers were sort of out of the picture at that point, just because the production had been through a lot of trouble. The quality issues with DCEU were still around. Zack Snyder was still technically director. Josh Whedon then, of course, stepped in. That, in its own right, a lot of conflict, a lot of friction behind the behind the scenes, I should say, and so that basically lowered the expectations for everybody. Right? It's like, this no longer was an Avengers film. It was just your typical top tier, top shelf, tier A comic book movie, like a Civil War or trying to think what else would fall into this, like a Guardians 2. It would be in above the 120s 130s range into the 140 to 160ish range opening weekend, and then depending on the quality, its legs would sort of play out from there, right? That's where we were up until we hit tracking, and tracking starts officially about 3 weeks out from release. And I won't go into the details of tracking of what it means, but essentially there's a lot of surveys and they come up with a number based on those survey numbers. And the numbers that were coming up for Justice League were low. They were about 120-ish, I believe it was the first tracking. So that was on the lower end of, I think, of the general expectations for the film. I think a lot of people, especially fans of DCEU and Warner Brothers and this whole world, were thinking that it would still do above 150. When that tracking hit, that would have been in, I guess, late October. Even before Thor came out, I think the tracking was in for Justice League. The issue there, it just basically kind of changed everything, right? It was no longer, oh, this isn't going to do Avengers numbers. It was like, oh, like, is this going to like fall into the Spider-Man Homecoming, Thor 3, Wonder Woman zone, like the 100 to 120-ish range? I think I was super skeptical of that tracking just because this is Justice League. Like, I've been following this movie since it was announced, and the expectation had always been high 180s, 190s into the $200 million. It's Batman, it's Superman, it's Wonder Woman, Cyborg, Aquaman. I mean, it was like big characters. It was supposed to be this big thing. But as tracking continued on before it was being released, essentially what happened is that tracking just got worse and worse and worse. Despite the fact that pre-sales for tickets were very good, something was not clicking with this movie. And that became super apparent when the review situation started to happen the week of release. The embargo felt really late. I think it was into Tuesday was the embargo. Then Rotten Tomatoes pulled this stunt where they held the Rotten Tomatoes score until they had their Screen It or something show, which was like 11 p.m. my time on Wednesday when it dropped. And then when it finally came out, it was bad. It was really, really bad news. The reviews were not good at all. And that got people pretty nervous about it. But even with those bad reviews, honestly, I feel like people, and I myself included, felt like, oh, it's still going to do like at least 120. Like, it's not going to like dip into it's not going to lose to like Spider-Man Homecoming. It's certainly going to do better than Wonder Woman's solo movie, right? And that's what I think that was the perception as it opened, coming on Wednesday night. Then when the previews hit, something didn't seem right again. It was just sort of like, if you're hearing me sort of recount this, it's just like, it started out as this concept of an Avengers movie doing like $200 million opening weekend. And then every year and month as we got closer, and right at the end, every day, every week, things just got more and more negative surrounding the film. And by the time the preview numbers came in, it was very clear that this was going to be a massive, massive flop. It ended up making under $100 million its opening weekend, $93.8 million to be exact, well below the other comic book movies of the year. Well, Thor 3 opened to 120 something. Spider-Man Homecoming, I think, was 117. Wonder Woman was 103, and Guardians 2 was in the 140s. And this was not even really in the same league as those films. And the expectation coming into this year was that, like, well, Justice League was going to beat all of those pretty handedly. Maybe Guardians 2 going to give it a run for its money, but for the most part, I think people thought Justice League, even so much as a year ago, 150 at least opening weekend. So it was a catastrophic flop, and it still is. And I think, part of me, I was on vacation, so I didn't get a chance to do the show. And so there's a lot of hot take reactions that happened. And I actually got to think about it a lot over the last couple of weeks. I think it's a much bigger disaster than people have really understood so far. The moment that it started to crash and I knew that it was going to do under 100, I posted a couple of things in various different forums. and the reaction was, oh, it's whatever, like they screwed up, they're gonna lose a lot of money, it's just the end of the Zack Snyder era at DCEU, they'll move on and do something different. I think people are underestimating the amount of money that was invested into this product and the huge shortfall or shortcoming it's going to have in terms of its revenue. It is the type of loss that will cost a lot of people their jobs, and I'm talking senior management and C-level people, and it will change the entire concept of DCU forever, right? Like it's such a massive failure that in a lot of ways DCEU will not continue like it was supposed to. And I think it also changes the comic book genre completely. And you have to start thinking about the bigger sort of long-term implications of it. You know, how is this going to react, or how is this going to play out with the general audiences? You know, because I think a lot of people think this is a siloed failure, and it's not. This failure will spread out not only to DCU, but to the comic book movie genre in general, and also into Hollywood in general. I think it's that big of a mistake here, which is why I want to do a whole show about it. Just sort of let's recap on the numbers of how it's been doing. $93 million opening weekend. It dropped 56% this last weekend and did $41 million. We're coming into its third weekend now. It is currently at, well, let's do a little, it's currently at 178. And let me do a little, they have a showdown here with all the DCEU movies on Box Office Mojo. If you don't use Box Office Mojo and you're interested in this stuff, you're doing it wrong. Just go to Box Office Mojo and like play around for hours on end. And they have such a good set of data to look at, and really cool like records and stuff, and really good data. So anyway, so just to give us, I'm just trying to build some perspective on where this movie is at right now. At the same point in time, Wonder Woman was at 227 million. Justice League is at 178. Suicide Squad was at 238. Batman and Superman was 270, and Man of Steel was 223. So it is at least about $50 million off Wonder Woman. And that was the lowest performer of DCEU up until this is the 13th day of release. So it hasn't even been out for 2 weeks. So it's a massive, massive disaster, right? So let's walk through. We talked about the how. It's sort of the what. Now we sort of talk about like, well, how did this happen, right? And then we'll kind of get to like maybe suggestions for DCEU and where this is going to go. So if we're talking about, and I like to break down what a film is all about and how we review its performance and why it did well or did poorly into a couple different categories. One major category is I call the product quality. Like, is it good or is it bad? And how is the product conceived? So we're going to start with both of those, and then we'll work over towards the marketing aspect of the film. So starting out with just product quality, it's probably the easiest one to talk about, right? So Rotten Tomatoes score for Justice League is 41%. It's a little bit better than Suicide Squad and Batman versus Superman, but it's lower than Man of Steel. It is a panned film. It was panned by critics. The average rating, this is a lot of reviews. This is not skewed. It's 285 reviews. 41%. Average rating was 5.3, which is terrible. Terrible, terrible. Top critics gave it a 26%. And that, to me, is much more important. The reviews that I went through and read, the better ones, the more professional ones, were more negative. Specifically, the reviewers over in Britain, who tend to be, honestly, a little bit more intellectual with their reviews. They have a stronger background, usually in art criticism, just because, I don't know, it's just the way that the cultures are. And they're also more skeptical and cynical, I would say. They tend to not give a pass to something just because a lot of people are into it, right? Which is opposed to American reviewers tend to have a sort of poptimism aspect to their reviews. Like if a lot of people like it, a lot of people are happy, they sometimes give it a break. And that has been especially true of comic book movies over the last 15 years. American reviewers give comic book movies breaks left and right. The Brits don't. And when you read through some of the better British reviews, they are vicious and they're in some levels mean, because I think they felt almost offended by how bad the film was, and they had to sit through it. So from that level, the critics absolutely hated it. Audiences were a little bit... there was a discrepancy here. Audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is 81%. Average rating was 4.1. Which says to me that, like, okay, audiences seem to really enjoy it. If you saw that on the face of it, you'd be like, well, you know, the critics thought one thing and the audience thought the other. And that wouldn't necessarily be the wrong way to read it, but I think if you read it that way in this situation, it's not right. Because it only made $93 million opening weekend. Right? So the people who did end up going and see this really enjoyed it. The problem is not a ton of people went to go see it. Right? So it's a skewed smaller sample. The cinema score is a B+, which is okay. And so what you're seeing there is that the people who did go see it had a good time. 81% is not terrible. It's not like ecstatic, oh, this was amazing. It was like, I enjoyed it. The problem there is, you know, it's so far significantly lower in terms of ticket sales than these other major blockbuster comic book movies, that I feel like that audience score is pretty skewed, to be honest with you. I love critics. I love art criticism because I tend to weight their value or their viewpoint a little bit more. Ultimately, when we're talking about product quality in Justice League, it's a failure, right? If you had to score it out of 100 in terms of, like, if you're scoring every single attribute of a film in terms of how successful you think it will be, kind of predicting it, the quality score here, I would give it like in a 40 or 30%. Right? It's trash. It's not a good film. It was a total mess. And you can talk about the context of how it was made and talk about how, you know, Snyder had to leave and Josh Whedon came in. Those are all interesting viewpoints, and I've talked about those before. They don't matter in this moment, right? When you're talking about product quality, is it good or is it bad? It's a binary thing, right? And this movie was bad, and it was not good. And I don't care what the audience score says, right? The critics looked at it and said, this is not only is this bad, this is trash, right? And I think they're much more honest about it than a lot of the people went to go see it, because a lot of people went to go see a type of movie like this. There's a lot of fanboyism going on. They wanted it to be good. It's like when I saw Garden State for the first time. I wanted it to be an A+ movie. It was a C- movie, but when I came out of it, I said it was an A. Like, I have that the same phenomenon's going on here. I think objectively, it's not a good film. Not a good film at all. So the quality was a major, major, major issue here on why it did so bad. And, you know, when you think about, like, the quality of DCEU in general, it's very, very bumpy. There's only been one DCEU film that was rated fresh, and that's Wonder Woman. Batman vs. Superman was an absolute disaster of a film. It was one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. Man of Steel was better. Suicide Squad was about the same level of Batman vs. Superman, just really trashy and boring. But Wonder Woman was good, and I think most people agree that Wonder Woman was good. It was an enjoyable comic book movie for the most part. And so you had quality issues here from the start, right? And you do have to wonder, thinking about, like, what went wrong. Why was there not somebody who stepped in at Man of Steel and said, hey, this is good, it's okay. I think it got 50% Rotten Tomatoes, but I need this in a 90% Rotten Tomatoes for Batman versus Superman. I am blown away that nobody at Warner Brothers stepped in and said, this is what I need. I don't care how you do it. I don't care what you need to do. Here's an extra $50 million, $100 million. Make it a 90% Rotten Tomatoes. Like, it's not rocket science. And look, art is difficult, and creating something this massive is one of the hardest undertakings you can do in the creative field, no doubt. But it was clear there was no Watchmen, if you will, at Warner Brothers saying, the quality has to be at this level or no, you're gone. And that didn't happen there. And that blows my mind for how much money is involved with these. It's billions of dollars that is involved. I'm surprised there's not a board of directors who said, you got to get rid of Zack Snyder. Get rid of him. He's not good enough. He can't do it. So not only did they not do that, I'm speaking now just in terms of product quality. Not only did they not do that between Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, which Batman vs Superman was a much bigger disaster than Man of Steel. They couldn't really do it between Suicide Squad. They recut a lot of Suicide Squad, especially the trailers, because of the negative reaction of Batman vs Superman. But they had multiple chances along the way before they got to the flagship Justice League to say, this is not good enough. I need you to do something different and better, or we're going to bring somebody else in. And maybe that's what happened with Justice League. The cover, I don't want to say cover because that's pretty insensitive, but Zack Snyder had a family tragedy, and Joss Whedon came in. I'm not entirely convinced that was totally voluntary. I think on some level, Warner Brothers is like, they test screened Justice League and it was awful and a disaster, and they said, we got to bring somebody else in. Zach can take a break here. We'll bring in Josh and let him see what he can do. And it wasn't good enough. The end product quality of Justice League is terrible, objectively terrible. So that's obviously a major reason why it is done so poorly. But as I get to, I'll move into the marketing stuff later. But there's a lot of movies that are poorly rated that do well, right? So that's not the only aspect that will create a failure at the box office. It's one big aspect. But usually it's not going to crush you in opening weekend, especially with such rich IP and famous IP like these characters, right? Like, there's an argument you can make that, like, even if it was rated 26% Rotten Tomatoes by top critics, you still could have easily gotten to $150 million opening weekend. Suicide Squad made 130 with characters that weren't like 1/10 as known as these characters. With a terrible Rotten Tomato score, and it did 130's opening weekend. So that's sort of like, it makes Justice League even that much more of a failure when you think about it. So product quality was absolutely terrible and poor. Another aspect of the sort of product or the film in of itself is the film or product conception. How is this movie conceived? How is it developed? Was there some error in that part of it? Not necessarily even the execution of the film, which we can see on screen wasn't really great, but in the idea of the film. And I think it's a lot more harder. It's harder to parse out, right? Because if you take a big step back and look at the comic book movie genre in general, it really popped off about 15 years ago in 2002 with Spider-Man. It's been going strong ever since. In terms of DC comics, right? Like the big one in the last decade was going to be the Batman series by Nolan, right? And Christopher Nolan really, I view Spider-Man 1 as the first wave of comic book movies, with sort of X-Men in 2000 being a precursor to it. And I'm referring to like this current phenomenon of comic book movies being the most important, most financially successful genre of film, which is a very unique situation and a very unique era of film in Hollywood, to be honest with you. And so Spider-Man 1 kicked it off in 2002. You had a lot of new comic book movies come out in that era. Not a lot of them that great. Spider-Man 2 people loved. You had Elektra, Catwoman, The Punisher, Hellboy. You also had Batman Begins in 2005, really sort of kicking off the resurgence of Batman. Fantastic Four, V for Vendetta is kind of its own thing. I think about, like, now I'm just realizing that Warner Brothers is sort of like the Alan Moore studio. They did V for Vendetta and Watchmen. Not exactly your typical comic book movies, but like very, very in that world. You had more X-Men movies come out, and it kind of got tired. And then it got really tired by the time it got to Spider-Man 3 in 2007 and Fantastic Four: Rise of Silver Surfer in 2007. It needed something new or it was going to fade out, right? And then that year in 2008, you have Iron Man come out starting MCU, and then you have Dark Knight come out that summer. And that really starts phase 2 or wave 2 of the comic book movie sort of era, a contemporary one. That keeps going and going and going. A lot of movies in that era, kind of mixed. You have some really good ones like Kick-Ass, I thought was great. X-Men First Class was not very good. Green Lantern was a failure. But you also have the kickoff of Captain America, First Avenger in 2011. The MCU starts to sort of grow and grow. And then you really hit the point here, the sort of the start of Wave 3 was Marvel The Avengers 2012, May, right? Opens to $207 million, breaks every conceivable record at the box office, blows people's minds completely, ends at $623 million domestically. Really changed the ball game with comic book movies. And that's why the comic book movie era has been so strong and sort of just like on top of everything, because it keeps on reinventing itself every 3 or 4 years, right? Like it's each wave hitting that makes it such a massive phenomenon, why it's been so powerful. So you have Wave 3 start with the Avengers in 2012. I think that lasts and goes. You have Iron Man 3. You have the reboot of Spider-Man in 2012. You have Man of Steel starting the DCEU universe in June of 2013. You have a lot of sort of duds too. The Wolverine wasn't very good. R.I.P.D. wasn't very good. Not necessarily a DC or Marvel thing, but sort of like, kind of an offshoot of that. But you also have this, MCU sort of buttressing itself with Thor, Captain America Winter Soldier in 2014. The reboot of Spider-Man doesn't go very well. Amazing Spider-Man 2 kind of falters in May of 2014. The X-Men series starts to falter as well. And what you're noticing is that the old standbys aren't doing as well anymore. Spider-Man can't catch a break. X-Men is really falling apart, it feels like. And again, these movies are making a lot of money and they're being profitable, but culturally they feel very tired. Things were not looking fantastic in 2015, I will say. In 2015, we were sort of the end of the third wave of the comic book movie era, the current one, the contemporary comic book era phenomenon. Ultron ultimately does well, almost at 191, closes out at 459. Terrible multiplier. Quality is hurt. Talk to anybody about Ultron now, they're like, ugh, gross. Right? Just did not. It made us so much money and so much profit, but I think it left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. You had Ant-Man come out that year, kind of a minor, not very well received, but not a huge movie by any stretch of imagination. To give you perspective, Age of Ultron opened at 191 its opening weekend. Ant-Man ended its entire domestic run at 180. So we're talking about two completely different tiers of films. And then you had Fantastic Four also in 2015. So this is the end of Wave 3 of comic book movies. And getting to that point, it felt, and I remember that moment, I was like, I don't know what's going on with this genre anymore. Ultron, despite the fact that it made a lot of money, was critically not well received, and I think as time went on, fans hated it more and more. Just not a well received movie. Ant-Man was, I think a lot of people liked it, just did not connect with the mass audience in the same way as sort of other comic book movies. And Fantastic Four was an abject failure. One of the millionth time that Fox has tried to do a good Fantastic Four movie. So at the end of 2015, and then there was nothing. Remember this? There was from Fantastic Four until Deadpool. That's August 2015 until February 2016. There was no comic book movie that came out, which now feels like it'd be impossible. Like, and this is like 2 years ago. It just feels like that would be impossible. That it's like 7 months, I guess, without anything. Then Deadpool comes out. I was not a believer in Deadpool. I thought it wasn't going to do very well. I thought it was going to open at $45 billion opening weekend. So much I know. But that was the feeling back then, right? That like comic book movies were waning. They weren't waxing. They were just sort of like, ugh. Deadpool opens to 132, ends up at 363. Start of Wave 4 of comic book movies. Total surprise. Completely out of the blue, blew everybody away. Every executive had their jaw on the floor, like, what the hell is going on? Just a crazy moment, right? And this from, we're trying to relate this back to Justice League. DCEU really started with Man of Steel, right? That's sort of the traditional start of DCEU, and that was in 2013. So it sort of went from the third wave of comic book movies, and now it transitioned over into the fourth wave. And I think that is where the product conception problems really arise. Deadpool changed everything. Just like Avengers changed everything in 2012, and Dark Knight changed everything in 2008, and Spider-Man 1 changed everything in 2002, Deadpool changed everything in 2016. This is only last year. So by the time Batman vs. Superman comes out only a month later, the style of Batman vs. Superman is deeply rooted in like early third wave comic book movies. Like it would have played okay in 2012, 2013, but that style, that super serious, over the top, no humor hardly whatsoever style doesn't jive with Wave 4. And this is where we have these product conception problems that lead into Justice League. Batman vs. Superman was totally wrong, completely wrong for the time period. It was so wrong that Warner Brothers freaked out about Suicide Squad and basically said, we got to reshoot stuff and we got to re-edit stuff and we got to remarket this thing. Because if Deadpool is what the future of comic book movies is, we need to make our movies more ironic, more fun, almost more like parodies, right? And so they ended up doing that. Didn't really help. Suicide Squad was a terrible movie. But that was sort of like the shift, right? It's like, we got to do something different. And sort of when you're leading up into Justice League, you're thinking, now obviously they can't read tea leaves, right? Justice League was shot, I can't even tell you when it was shot, but it was probably shot at least a year and a half, 2 years ago, right? So it was being shot, I believe, I want to say late 2016. We were already in that shift had already happened to a new sort of wave of comic book movies. And Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was right in the wheelhouse. Super fun, super colorful, super vibrant. Thor Ragnarok, same thing, hits a home run. Why? It's not super serious. It's super totally fun, a lot of jokes, very colorful. Right, it is in the wheelhouse of Wave 4 of this comic book movie phenomenon. Justice League, right? When you think about product conception, the characters may have been great, the writing may have been okay, whatever. I'm not going to get into that, but just the conception of the film and its tone does not jive at all with what's been happening over the last 3 to 4 years. And I think one of the issues there is they were locked in. They were locked in way too early with the tone of the film that they wanted to make. Justice League has more in common with Man of Steel than it does with Thor Ragnarok. And that was a major, major problem that they were not able to figure out. Like, essentially the ship was sailing in a certain direction and they just could not turn it. It was too big. It was like trying to turn the Titanic. There's an iceberg right in front of you. Right, there's Batman versus Superman's multiplier right in front of you, and you're on the Titanic, and they couldn't turn fast enough. Is essentially what happened. They tried bringing in Josh Whedon and stuff like that, but it could not fix the foundation that was built poorly on Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman. So there's a part of me that says that Justice League may have been doomed from the start. Bad timing, poor foundation, and so those things I would put in sort of the product conception box as being not great. Also, I think too, something to mention is that the Zack Snyder viewpoint of a comic book movie was really strange when you think about it, because when you look back at Man of Steel, what a weird movie. I grew up with comic book movies, and I've been super attuned to this whole wave of comic book movies, and I'm talking about since 2000. I've seen most of them. I know what they're all about. You look at Man of Steel and you're like, what the fuck is this? Like, it's just so strange to me. It just seems really, really obtuse. And what I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily follow the genre conventions that were laid down by, say, X-Men and Spider-Man and sort of the Marvel movies. Oddly enough, and it kind of makes sense, the DCEU was mostly indebted to the Dark Knight series by Christopher Nolan. And that was that, it's a comic book movie, but it almost feels like an adult drama. Right? It's dark, it's gritty, the characters are brooding and morose. It's just almost oppressively sad, right? and Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman and Justice League all have that tonal moroseness and sadness and seriousness and stoicness in common. And so it's fascinating that they sort of took what Nolan was doing, but what Nolan did that was fascinating is it did have that tone, but it had that tone because the stuff that he was talking about and the ideas that he was engaging in were of a level that was much higher than what Zack Snyder was capable of doing. And I think that's one of the big issues here, is that Warner Brothers and Snyder made the choice to kind of follow the tone of Nolan's Batman series, but they couldn't match that tone with what I would call the artistic wisdom of what Christopher Nolan was doing, because Christopher Nolan was trying to bring a genre, the comic book movie genre, and bring it up to a level that felt more in line with American classic films like The Godfather or Apocalypse Now. Now, did he get there? I think on Dark Knight he got pretty fucking close. Like I just rewatched that movie 2 weeks ago or something, whenever Thanksgiving was. I guess that was a week ago. It was on Thanksgiving night. You know, I sat there with my uncle who's in his 70s, a kind of curmudgeon. I was like, "You've never seen this? It's a masterpiece." And so he falls asleep at anything. He sat there and watched the entire thing and did not fall asleep once. Like, it's one of those movies that is just like so engrossing that you just can't turn away. And it had a vibrancy and a vitality to that film. But it was also at the same time very serious and very sort of definitely some brooding, not a lot of humor, right? And so Zack Snyder took that, and Warner Brothers basically said, hey, continue on, or maybe they didn't say this, maybe it was Snyder's choice, continue on this vibe, right, this path, but also let's create a whole universe and bring in all these different characters and create this, 20 movie series out of that. And I think that was a major mistake. And this is all sort of the product conception of Justice League that we're talking about. That was a major mistake. A mistake that MCU did not make. MCU and Marvel and Disney, it wasn't Disney at the time, it was Marvel, with Iron Man, made the choice to say, we're going to stay within the genre conventions of the traditional 2000s comic book movie. We're going to use the template that Spider-Man laid down, maybe a little bit of X-Men, and sort of work within those boundaries and that frame and just make a really, really great version of that. And that's essentially what they've been doing over and over again. And they've always found a way to incorporate new things culturally that were going on in film at the time to sort of spruce up that idea. But the frame of their movies has always been the traditional, it's traditional comic book movie, where it's not overly serious. There's always a sort of playful, sort of maybe even ironic disconnect to what's happening on screen. It's not real life, right? DC didn't have that. And DCEU didn't have that. It had a little bit in Wonder Woman, especially that first hour of Wonder Woman, which was great. But they didn't have that disconnect, and they did not follow kind of the boilerplate comic book movie path. And I think with DCEU and leading up to Justice League, they tried to do both. They tried to do the classic American cinema sort of ambitious Nolan style, where we want to make like super great art and like go for Best Picture, but at the same time they tried to also adhere to the building a universe, create kind of a boilerplate type movie at the same time. So they, at the one hand, they're totally breaking genre conventions, and on the other hand, they're trying to conform to them. And that's your end product, is these super messy, super confused films like Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, and now Justice League, that just don't work. They don't work as popcorn entertainment, and they don't work as vying for Best Picture, right? They don't work on the Dark Knight level of trying to be some high art, which Nolan was successful at. Maybe not with Dark Knight Rising, but with Dark Knight. And on the other hand, they're not successful at doing the popcorn MCU stuff, right? Or even the Transformers type stuff, or Pirates of the Caribbean, that's sort of the popcorn world. There are no man's land in between those two. And I think that's where the product conception of Justice League really failed. And so when I'm looking at this and I'm taking a step back and thinking it's all about Justice League, what is, how did this all go wrong? I think from the start, the product conception was just off. They didn't know what they really wanted to accomplish with this stuff. What they wanted to accomplish based on their sort of copying of the whole MCU thing was, we want to make really, really good comic book movies that are popcorn entertainment. That's what MCU is. They tried to do that, but they brought in Snyder, who has a darker sort of tone to his movies, and they felt maybe indebted to the Nolan series to try and do something different than MCU, and it failed. So I think, the product quality that was so low with Justice League is partly the failure of the product conception, how it was developed, right? The idea, even before anything was put down on the screen, was probably a bad idea, right? And so that's a lot stacked against Justice League when you're looking back on it, right? And so sort of the second half of the conversation here, or not even the second half, maybe the last third, is talking about marketing, right? So you have this product, it's not great, but it has this huge following, massive following, follows DCEU. Suicide Squad opens to 130, ends at 325. Batman versus Superman, opens at 166, ends at 330. You're thinking, with the type of characters in Justice League, even if the film's not great and the quality's not good, and maybe the conception was poor from the start, you're thinking, at least I can do Suicide Squad. At least I can do, I would guess, based on that, in between Suicide Squad and Batman vs Superman. Or maybe even better than Batman and Superman, because remember how that popped off and then died with an opening weekend because the quality was so low? Maybe you'd aim for something like a 150, 170 range. That's what I would be thinking in terms of my marketing spend. But when we look at the marketing, the quality was okay. There was nothing about it that stood out. That's what they did really well with Suicide Squad, is the marketing was phenomenal on that. They did a really good job of the music and sort of really playing up the Harley Quinn, Margot Robbie character, right? She just really made that film and that marketing, it just felt really fresh and powerful and new. So I don't see any major problems with the marketing. Well, I'll say this. The marketing quality was adequate. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't amazing enough to get general audiences who weren't already interested in the DC world and comic book world to go, right? So on that level, it was a failure, right? It wasn't an abject failure. I think they did an okay job, but they didn't win over the general audiences, which is what would have taken it into the 120 to 150 and on up range. If you're thinking about who saw this movie, it's comic book fans, and that's pretty much it. There's a lot of them. There's tons of comic book fans out there on both sides and all sides of the whatever. It's not even really a battle, but like the MCU DCEU issue, right? Like, well, I think both of them went to go see this, but they didn't lock in the general audience at all and did not excite them. It was just sort of like, hey, do you like comic books? Hey, do you like Wonder Woman? Hey, do you like Batman? Then you'll love this movie. That's not that exciting for general audiences. You need to do something bigger and better, especially because we've been so inundated with comic book films over the last 15 years, especially over the last 5 years. And so you're thinking about the marketing quality, I think, was middling. It was good enough to get the comic book fans excited, but not good enough to get the general audience excited. If you're looking at the quantity or the quantity and the timing of the marketing, I can't really fault it. It followed a pretty standard timeline for marketing a film like this. Like, they started out super early, got a lot of the social media of the stars involved. Come on, like Wonder Woman was the best advertisement for Justice League you'd ever have, right? Opening up in June. So you would think that all would have built towards something bigger than what happened. And the timing, it seemed pretty on par. And then, who they were targeting. I think when I'm looking at the marketing, I'm seeing one big issue is that it was too much fan service marketing was the main issue. And then also that leads to the targeting. Who are you targeting for the marketing of Justice League? Right? Suicide Squad played so well with people under 25. So well. The Justice League advertising did not seem aimed towards them. It seemed like the Justice League marketing was aimed towards fans of DC Comics, fans of Batman vs Superman, and fans of Man of Steel. It didn't even look that focused to fans of Wonder Woman, which it done so well over the summer. And it didn't look like it was trying to get anybody outside of the comic book world. And so I think you had some pretty big issues with the marketing in general. But I don't, it didn't feel like marketing in and of itself made this movie fail. When we take a big step back and look at this and kind of wrap it all up into a package here, what went wrong with Justice League? I think the biggest red flag to me was that the product conception was so false and wrong from the start, right? They didn't have the right tone or idea from the start of this entire series, and they never fixed it. It should have been fixed after Man of Steel. It also should have been more dynamic. The thing about MCU is Thor Ragnarok is the perfect example of them turning the ship quickly. Because if Thor 3 was a serious sort of brooding film, like some of the other MCU movies were, I don't think it's going to play as well at all. I don't think it's going to play anywhere near as well as it did. So MCU was able to switch the tone of their movies pretty quickly. Guardians 2 was super colorful, super bright. There's a whole criticism of MCU and their color palette and how washed out it looked and gray it looked. They changed. They saw that criticism and changed it. DCU did not do that. So I'm looking at where everything went wrong. It's like you certainly had marketing issues where I think it was marketed poorly and it was too focused on the sort of built-in fan base, too much fan service in the marketing. The product quality was terrible, but I think it all leads back to the product conception. It really does. It was just conceived poorly from the start. Some people say it was rushed. I don't know. They had plenty of time here. Man of Steel came out in 2013. Batman vs Superman came out in 2016. If anything, I would say maybe Justice League should have shot for maybe late 2018 instead of 2017, because what ended up happening is the errors of Batman vs Superman, which were pretty blatant, they weren't able to correct those before they started production on Justice League. So it was sort of, I would have pushed it back immediately, at least 6 months to a year. So I think there was definitely a product development timing issue there. But I think ultimately here, when I'm seeing the major problem is that it wasn't a good movie. And it wasn't a good movie because they didn't take the time to write something that was interesting. And they didn't take the time to develop the characters in the right way. People say MCU, they had more movies leading up to Avengers. I mean, hardly. When you think about what led up to the Avengers, in that world, you obviously had Iron Man was the first, right? Then what else did you have? I guess you had Thor, and then you had Captain America, and I think that's it, isn't it? I think that was it. Captain America. Was Thor after that? Did Thor come out in 2012? I don't remember. I have to look it up now. But that's a bullshit argument, right? There's the same amount of films before the first Avengers film in the MCU as there are before Justice League and DCEU. So it wasn't necessarily they didn't have enough solo films. It's just they weren't good. The solo films weren't good enough. Iron Man is good. Captain America the first one, American whatever, is also good. So they had built up the hype based on these really good individual movies. DCEU didn't do that or couldn't do that because the original movies were terrible or they weren't very good. There's no argument that Man of Steel can even hold a candle to Iron Man. It's just not there. So, I think essentially Justice League, the point I'm trying to make was it was doomed to fail. It didn't matter. The marketing wasn't perfect, but it almost didn't matter because at the end of the day, the tone was way off from where comic book movies are, and the characterization was poor, and the director was wrong. Right? So when you have those elements to start out with, you're going to have a bad, shitty movie at the end of the day. And your box office is going to suffer pretty dramatically from this. To me, Justice League is almost like the F4 Fantastic Four version of sort of the ensemble film. right? What I mean by that is like Fantastic Four, that F4 that came out in 2015, was just a disaster. It was poorly written. It was poorly conceived. The director was bad. Justice League feels like a much bigger version of that. You know, when you think about it, it's like and thinking about how moving forward could you change this, right? How can you avoid such a massive disaster? And I think that what sets Justice League apart in terms of its failure is that like there was so much leading up to it, right? Like there were so many big films that led up to this moment that was supposed to be the grand finale of that. And because those earlier movies were not good enough, the end result is those failures sort of compounded into the massive failure of Justice League. That's exactly what happened. And so it's almost like it's less the fact that Justice League is a shitty movie, and it's more the fact that the creative universe leading up to it was just poorly constructed. And so like if you're going to build a big movie on these smaller movies and smaller stories, and those stories aren't good, then the big thing's going to collapse, right? Obviously. And I think that's exactly what happened here. And so we think about like moving forward with DCEU and what they're going to do. Here's my suggestions based on what I've seen. I think in terms of Justice League, put it on ice. Don't even think about another Justice League movie anytime soon. I would say at least 4 years before you even think about it. Focus on what has been working in DCEU, right? Focus on Wonder Woman. Right now, Wonder Woman is the flagship of DCEU, which is crazy to think because 3 or 4 years ago, you wouldn't even imagine that, but it's true. Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot are the queens of DCEU right now. So give them the keys to the castle. Let them run. I would, if they could, push up that Wonder Woman maybe even as much as they can. I'm not sure when it's coming out now. I think it's 2019. It's not listed yet. I think June 2019 or maybe even later than it doesn't really say. But I know it's 2019. I would try and push it up to get it out by the end of 2018. Right? You don't want a lot of time to happen here. I know you have Aquaman coming out. Maybe push Aquaman. Maybe push it out. You know, Aquaman's supposed to come out December 2018. That's a year away. Like either move it up or move it back. Let's get Wonder Woman another movie sooner rather than later. And then you're talking about Flash. Flash was sort of one of the characters that really stood out as being really good in Justice League. So maybe give him a standalone movie but take time to write a good script. I cannot emphasize this enough. Quality does matter. MCU is not perfect, and their movies are not brilliant across the board. I find them pretty boilerplate, honestly very boring for the most part. But they connect with general audience as well because they are well constructed, and they do have interesting plots and interesting things going on, and they're not fucking boring. Like Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman are just boring messes. I also thought Suicide Squad was the same. So I would focus on these individual characters in the sort of the DCEU and try and get some really top tier grade A films out of those individual characters. Throw out the ensemble stuff. Do what MCU did and sprinkle in other characters when you can in these origin films. And maybe eventually down the line you can do something big like Justice League, but you have to earn it first. And they didn't earn it. They had bad movies leading up to it and it ended up being a disaster. If it had good movies leading up to it, if all 3 movies before DCEU were great, Justice League were great, I think we'd be talking a completely different story right now. But they weren't. So I think they need to, on the one hand, slow down with the ensemble stuff and the big picture stuff. Focus on Wonder Woman. Focus on Batman. Get rid of Ben Affleck. I'm sorry. He does not work as Batman at all on any level. Get somebody else in the door who's younger. Maybe tied in with the Gotham TV show. I don't know. That's getting crazy. Focus on Wonder Woman. Focus on Batman. Superman needs another movie soon. Get him on board. Henry Cavill, he's a great Superman. Like, I don't really find anything wrong with him. I think he's been getting really shitty material to work with. Get him another movie. Start with Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman. Okay, you got Aquaman coming up. I think that was kind of a mistake, but that's all right. Get those three people, those three main sort of legs to the table, right? Create a foundation, and then work off from that, right? That's the best that you can do right now. Any minor characters, don't even think about it. Focus on the major characters, get them going, get them really good movies. Cancel anything. Cyborg movie, cancel it. Flash movie, I just said, oh, maybe. No, cancel it. I just said cancel it now. Screw it. Just get Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman right. And you can work on that for the next 5 to 10 years, right? And that should be their focus. Maybe there's another Justice League or something like it in 5-ish years, 6-ish years, but I wouldn't count on it. And Warner Brothers shouldn't count on it either. You know, build off of the success of Wonder Woman and see what else you can do with Batman and Superman as separate entities. Don't bring them together again. And go from there. I think that's the best that they can do. DCEU, as it was conceived, is a disaster, and it fell apart, and it's a failure, right? What they conceived 5 years ago did not work, right? And Justice League is going to lose money. I don't care what anybody says to you. It's going to lose cash. Total costs for this are probably at least $800 million. I would say it's more like $850 to $900 million in total releasing costs worldwide, every platform. That's an entire business just sort of failing all of a sudden. It's going to be off about $300 million from what they want it to be. So I think, you know, the DCEU as it was conceived is over. It's done, right? Build DCEU 2.0 on Wonder Woman, another Superman movie, and then a new Batman. Get rid of Ben Affleck. That's my sort of my diagnosis for DCU and Warner Brothers. Start with that and then see if there's anything else there. Don't assume that those movies are going to be fantastic and then schedule a Justice League movie 4 years from now. That's a mistake. That's exactly what they did here. You cannot expect that to happen. And also stop trying to compete with MCU. You lost, right? It's over. MCU decimated you. And not that it's like a head-to-head competition, but DC made it a head-to-head competition. That's on them, right? Like, they could have done their own thing and not have copied MCU, but they didn't do that. And that's one of the big reasons why they're in such a shitty spot right now. But I do have hope for them. You know, it's such a good group of characters. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that. And I'm interested to see Wonder Woman goes. I really hope that they don't screw up Batman, because he's such an interesting character. Maybe he's been a little bit sort of overused in the last 20 years, but you know, it's a good enough character where you can find something to do with it. And I think in terms of these new films that they're making, make them unique and interesting, and make sure that they can get an 80% Rotten Tomatoes. That's what I would say. Like, focus on quality and writing first, and worry about the marketing and the universe building later, because that will create the foundation where you can create a universe from that. You can't create a universe first in your head and just fill it in with just bullshit filler like they tried to do. It just doesn't work. MCU was built on Robert Downey Jr.'s and Jon Favreau's Iron Man. Like, that was built on the quality of that movie. And DCEU can do the same. It's just they have to focus on quality writing, acting, and bring in some interesting directors that are maybe a little bit out there, a little bit more arty than they're used to. Get Zack Snyder, you're done. He should never work for Warner Brothers again or whatever. Maybe smaller films. He has failed on such a monumental level. I don't know if I'd ever hire him again, to be honest with you. He can get into production or something else. Like, he's not a good director. And I think it comes down to this, like, focus on creating unique and interesting, high quality films, and you'll find a way to build on that and do something bigger. Any other path, I think, is going to be failure for them. And I hope they don't try and do what they did and just, hey, here's this random character, let's give him a movie, here's another one. All right, they're all going to tie into this big movie in 5 years, and everything has to fall in line with this big movie. If they try and do that, it's just not going to work for them. But I think heads will roll at Warner Brothers. Zack Snyder will be gone. Ben Affleck will be gone. A lot of the C-level people at Warner Brothers who were responsible for this will be fired or moved, sent out to pasture, if you will. And I think they will course correct by focusing on Wonder Woman and Superman. And I have hope that they'll do okay. There's also the possibility that comic book movies in general start to really wane pretty quickly here. I don't know. I've always been saying that it was a possibility. I think Black Panther is going to do pretty well in February next year. Avengers Infinity War comes out in May. I think people are going to be surprised by how underwhelming Infinity War does. That's just my gut feeling. Obviously, it was the biggest trailer views in the last 24 hours. It just came out yesterday, the new trailer. I was not impressed, to be honest with you. It didn't really look like anything interesting or new. It certainly felt like it was more third wave comic book movie than fourth wave. And then you got Deadpool 2, Ant-Man. There's supposed to be a DC film coming out in July 2018. What the fuck is that? Venom's coming out. There's animated Spider-Man's coming out next year too. Aquaman. There's a lot of comic book movies next year. We'll see where everything goes. Right? By the time we get to Captain Marvel in March of 2019, it might be a completely different ball game. And then there's another Avengers movie in May 2019. I mean, I don't know. I just get the feeling that this whole era and the whole phenomenon at some point is going to have to move on. And I've talked a lot about the waves of comic book movies. If Deadpool was the fourth wave, what's going to be the fifth wave? And if you look at that timeline, let's say about 3 to 4 years out, is Captain Marvel going to be the new time wave? Or the new start of the new wave? There's a lot of untitled DC and Marvel movies scheduled for 2019 and 2020. We'll see what happens then. We'll see what happens. I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe the new Gambit movie from Fox is going to be the start of the fifth wave. Or maybe not. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the last wave of comic book movies, and it will sort of go the way it went in the 80s, where it just sort of like in 90s, where it was always around. The comic book movies are always going to be around, but they're not going to be the pinnacle and the most successful and biggest genre in film. That's also a possibility. We'll see what happens. Okay, so I've gone on long enough about this stuff. So if you're interested, follow me on Twitter at the Wildline Podcast. I'm on SoundCloud. I'm on YouTube. Hit me up wherever. I check my Twitter probably the most often. If you ever have a question or anything like that, always reach out. I'm always happy to answer stuff for people. And keep listening. So schedule will be, I'll probably do a weekend show on Sunday to talk about what happened this weekend, and probably a year-end special during the middle of next week. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast.